In the last segment, we talked about the 1905-06 revolution and how the revolutionaries managed to gain control of the seat of government. The king gave up. In this segment, I want to begin with talking about what happens next when the revolutionaries begin to control the government. And I want to begin by discussing the control system. The best way to understand the change in the control system that takes place after a revolution is to compare it with the control system that existed prior to the revolution. So if we look at the 1905 period just before the revolution, using the mechanism that I discussed earlier with the primary, secondary, and tertiary division of means of control. In 1905, this was the situation. Normative habitual, that is the belief, widespread acceptance of the dominant norms of the society based on custom, was at the primary level. Utilitarian was at the secondary level, a little bit below the normal level, indicating things were kind of rough and tough. And then finally, at the lowest level, was the coercion and normative active. Normative active for a traditional society, by definition, will always be at the lowest point because the society is in a pre-mass political phase and you cannot mobilize masses that are in that state of mind. So it's not going to be, they're not mobilizable, they're not reachable. So this is, if you notice, a pattern that corresponds to the traditional society control system. Now, as we move to 1907, a year after the revolution, the control pattern changes dramatically. And as you know, revolution by definition is the overthrow of the existing norm. So one of the things that you see is that NH shifts sharply downward because the norms that used to provide a basis of control are no longer accepted, at least as a result of the revolution. So NH, normative habitual, goes way down to the C. You also have to take into account that when this is happening, you are really stepping in the interest of several people because the tribal chiefs, the land-owning elites, the feudal lords, and the conservative religious leaders, all of these people who are now your counter-elites, because they used to be the elites, the new regime now takes over, the revolutionaries are the ruling elites, and they become the counter-elites, and they're going to hate your guts, and they're going to come after you. In other words, right off the bat, as the revolutionaries begin to rule Iran, they are being strongly challenged by the counter-elites who lost power. So the revolutionaries tried to reform a very, very rotten system. They tried to stop corruption, and at the same time, the treasury of the country was bankrupt, so they needed to bring some revenue, so they began to collect taxes. And then also they tried to reach the masses to get their support. What happened was that it simply didn't work. So when that happens, you will see that utilitarian, the material part of it, the material goods, is actually going to go down a little bit. And it moved towards C. Now, the only group that the revolutionaries truly satisfied and were experienced a sense of empowerment was the people in the cities who supported revolution, and for them, the utilitarian power part of the utilitarian, the power need, the need for influence, for them that went up. And therefore the pro-change elites and their supporters felt very good about the revolution, and therefore for them the normative active was also up. So normative active suddenly goes from tertiary to the primary, but only for the supporters of the revolution. And you got to keep in mind that the main symbols that attracted these revolutionaries were two of them: democracy, because they got rid of the dictatorial regime of the kings, and monarchy. And then the other part of it was independence, because these people viewed the monarchs and the old system as beholden to the imperial powers. And one of the aim of the revolution was to make sure Iran will be an independent nation. Having said that, you also got to keep in mind that Iran at this juncture in its history really is about 1 to 2% politically participant. Well over 90% of the populations are in the rural areas, and for these people, they don't even know what's going on in the cities, and therefore they're not at all aware of what's going on, and they're pretty much untouched. Really, when we talk about the revolution, we're talking about two cities in Iran. One, Tehran, the capital; the other, Tabriz, another large city in the Azerbaijan province in the north west of Iran. Finally, in the control system, the coercion went even lower than the level that it was prior to the revolution. After all, you have a liberal regime, and the liberal regime is not going to be as coercive and as brutal as the monarchy was. But the fact also was that the revolutionaries really had a tough time, difficult time, to provide even for law enforcement. So you can see there is a kind of a chaotic quality to their rule. The result was that Tehran was excited and was clearly under the control of the revolutionaries. But beyond Tehran and maybe Tabriz, you really couldn't go anywhere else. Bandits were all over the place, and in the villages and elsewhere, the landlords and the feudal lords were in charge. Now, what about the foreigners? And in the case of Iran, we're really talking about two powers, Great Britain and Russia. Well, the revolutionaries' expectation, if you recall from last segment, was that British, being liberal, would be supportive of the revolution, and of course, Russia, being rank or bloc conservative, they would oppose it. Well, their expectation proved to be wrong. The British did not like them at all, and the Russians liked them as much as the British. Both Britain and Russia viewed the revolutionary regime as rotten. With that situation in mind, what you had was in 1907, you get Britain and Russia concocting or coming up with an infamous 1907 treaty. What the treaty in essence did was to divide Iran into three distinct zones. Northern Iran was designated as being the Russian sphere of influence. The southern Iran was defined as the British sphere of influence. And then there was a central part which was considered a neutral buffer zone, and that's where supposedly Iran and government of Iran was to operate. So Iranian liberals, who had all along expected the British to help them, instead found that the British and the Russian united together to disempower them. Therefore, the pro-change elites were deeply angered and dismayed at the British. Now, as we shall see later in this course when we begin to discuss other Middle Eastern countries, you will see that this betrayal of the liberal, pro-change elites by the Western power is an often repeated pattern. It's going to repeat itself in other countries such as Egypt, such as Iraq, and such as Jordan. So this is a common pattern. And one of the things I'm doing in this course is to go in greater detail in the case of Iran to illustrate these patterns so you have a good idea how these patterns actually work out. And then so when we get to other countries, you will be able to recall the details from Iran and you will see that the patterns is pretty much repeated. So this is, keep in mind that these are going to be repeated pattern. Now by this time, the revolutionaries had realized that in order to stay in power, in order to make the revolution work, they need to focus on improving what really matters to most people, and that's the utilitarian, the material portion of the utilitarian control. In other words, they should be able to provide the basic or satisfy the basic needs of the people, and also be able to provide for public safety and law enforcement. What this meant then was to raise U sub M, utilitarian, the material needs, and coercion in the sense of law enforcement, not in the sense of kind of a brutal crackdown, but in the sense of law enforcement so that businesses and the bazaar and the people have a sense of safety and a rule of law in their society. So this is the realization, and they are now frantically trying to find a way to raise these two elements in control, material needs of the population and law enforcement. And it is at this stage that we get what I call the Morgan-Shuster episode. It's one of those strange phenomena related to the point I was making earlier. In 1910, the Iranians, almost four years into the revolution, the Iranians tried to get some foreign financial advisors to help them push up the utilitarian as well as to improve law enforcement. To do so, they decided to find a neutral person, and they went to America and they came up with one W. Morgan Shuster. Right off the bat, the Russians objected because his name sounded Jewish, and the Russians were deeply anti-Semitic. Be that as it may, Shuster was probably the best choice Iran could have made. He was a liberal. He was highly empathetic to the cause of the revolutionaries, which, remember, was a liberal revolution. And equally important, he was a very competent technocrat and understood finance, banking very well because of his experience. Shuster, if I could digress for a moment, stands in sharp contrast to another American by the name of Paul Bremer, a man that President Bush put in charge of Iraq during the early part of the occupation. And Bremer was neither a liberal nor empathetic nor competent. Going back to Shuster, you will see that when you read about it, he began to put Iran's financial house in order in a very, very brief time that he was there. One of the things he did was to bring in some Swedish officers to train the police and the army. And at the same time, he began to reform the financial accounting system in Iran, and he was really General Secretary of the Iran's treasury. So for a fleeting moment, there was unparalleled excitement in Iran. the sense of efficacy for the first time among the revolutionaries really peaked with the coming of Shuster. It really appeared to them that they finally got their act together. So Shuster started to really get the control system established, improve the material needs of the population, and Iran was suddenly on the right path. But Shuster committed a major mistake. By acting as if he was a genuine Iranian nationalist, he failed to bow to Russian and British interests. He started to take on the British and the Russian agents head on. If they had not paid their taxes, Shuster would confiscate their properties and state. So these agents became very angry, and they began to complain to their masters that this guy is really ruining life for them and they cannot go on like this. The other thing was that Shuster made a second important mistake. He found a British man, his name was Major C.B. Stokes, who was very much like Shuster himself, who was liberal, who was very empathetic toward the Iranians, and he was as dedicated as Shuster to help Iran to establish a liberal democratic form of government. What Shuster did was to delegate the authority to Stokes to become the administrator in the northern province of Azerbaijan. Now, in order to understand the mistake in this appointment, you have to go back to a slide earlier, actually to a slide that we see here, and that is the 1907 treaty. Remember, on the basis of that treaty, the northern part of Iran, where Azerbaijan is part of it, was supposedly sphere of Russian influence. So when an American appointed a British to be in charge of the province within their sphere of influence, immediately Russian saw a British-Jewish conspiracy. They were literally up in arms, and they demanded Stokes to be fired, so Stokes was fired. But that was not enough for them. Russians gave an ultimatum to Iran demanding that Shuster must also go. And by the way, on this, the British had no objection to any of that. They were actually cooperating with the Russian. So when the Russians gave their ultimatum demanding for the ouster of Shuster, Iranian at first turned it down. But then the Russian army marched into Iran, and Iranians had no option other than to capitulate. In the meantime, Morgan Shuster was forced out. He came back to the United States, and he wrote a very good book called, quite appropriately, The Strangling of Persia. What is important about Iran's experience with Morgan Shuster was that it became truly a formative experience for Iranians. Because of Shuster's, they saw the United States as the only power in the West who supported them. So the United States became ridiculously popular. I want to kind of give you an anecdotal account of the situation then by referring to my mentor's trip, Richard Cottam, who went to Iran in 1951 to research and write his dissertation on Iranian nationalism. When he arrived in Iran, he discovered that United States popularity back in 1951 had no bounds. And he told me a story that in 1951, he met a group of young Iranian naval officers, and they all asked him, they wanted to know who won the bout between the British Randy Turpin and the American Sugar Ray Robinson, because they hadn't heard the news. They all wanted to see the British defeated. And they told Richard Cottam that if Turpin wins, they will all die. That anecdote kind of gives you the legacy that was left by their experience with Morgan Shuster back there, and then also another episode which I will mention shortly. So you've got to get it into the equation that somewhere down the line, in a couple of years, after 51, we will betrayed them. But at that time, we were the hope, and by 1953, that hope was gone.